My name is Cynthia Cox. I'm married and I have 2 children, and I just really had it on my heart to share my testimony, to give others hope about addiction, and also to destroy the stigma that is surrounded about addiction, because it can happen to anyone at any given time. It touches every family in America today, even if you haven't experienced it yourself. I'm sure that you have a sibling or a spouse or even an aunt, an uncle that has been touched by addiction. So I just really want to share hope and encourage people, and just to let people know that through the power and the blood of Jesus that you can overcome addiction. And so I'm going to start from the beginning. So I was born from a mother and father that were very young, and they were kids themselves, and I'm not sure if they were really ready to have children. And it was just a very toxic relationship that I was born into. Both parents were addicts, both parents struggled with their own demons, and so that made me vulnerable. As soon as I was born in a place that was very toxic, and so I picked up a lot of characteristics very young that I shouldn't have picked up, and I saw an unhealthy relationship very young, at a very young age. Luckily, my father was very close to his father, which is my papaw, and we were able to live with them. So I had my grandma and grandpa kind of covering me from the time I was 1 until about 9. So that helped me see some form of normalcy, and it really kind of helped me to have that little bit of seed sown in my heart and have that covering and protection. But when I turned 9, my parents split. And so my mother moved us away to Goshen. And that is really when I felt like I wasn't protected anymore, because I had, in a sense, my grandparents lost that protection. And my mother was an addict, so we moved out to Goshen into a trailer park. And I started running with the wrong crowd, looking for love in all the wrong places. And it just kind of put me in a spot where I was open to many different things, addiction and depression and all of that. So by the time I was probably 14, I was an addict. And I was drinking on the weekends. I didn't really think that I had a problem. I feel like most people, when they're young and they're teenagers, they just kind of feel like we're just partying, we're just kids, we're just having fun. But you don't realize, especially when you have the genetic makeup already of parents that have passed that gene on to you, it's generational. So when I thought I was just partying and just, experimenting with drugs and marijuana and alcohol, really what I was doing was I was opening the door on my spirit to all of these different things. And so by the time I was 16, my addiction had progressed very quickly. So I went from partying on the weekends with friends, still doing okay in school, doing sports, still playing softball, to 16, I am a full-blown heroin addict. I mean, I'm at this point, I'm 16 years old, and looking back now, I'm sure my mom was mortified, because I can't imagine, having a 16-year-old on the street like that. But that is the gruesome reality of addiction. I was driving downtown to different drug dealers, and I was buying heroin off the streets. I had many overdoses. I'm pretty sure 3 that I think were where I overdosed and stopped breathing and had to be hospitalized. At 17, I had endocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart valve where my heart was infected, and I almost died in the hospital at 17. And so that is when my mother, I think, really realized, because she was an addict at the time too. So she wasn't really paying much attention, but she knew that something was wrong, but she was also fighting her own demons. So she didn't have much to give in the way of help besides, get her in treatment, try to save her life. And what's crazy is when I was in the hospital and almost dying, you'd think that in a normal person's mind, they would stop. They would never do that again. But the powerlessness of addiction, it doesn't work that way. You go way past your rock bottom. You go way further than you ever thought you could. And so that was me. So by the time that I got 18, I was just to the point where I was completely riddled with addiction. And I went to my very first treatment center at 18 years old, and it was in Xenia, Ohio, and I was there for 24 hours because they told me I couldn't smoke cigarettes. And also because with heroin, if I'm not sure if anyone's familiar, but it gives you violent withdrawals. So my body was going into shock, and I ran. I took off on foot in Xenia, Ohio, hundreds of miles away from, my home. And I had called my mother and my stepdad at the time and asked them to come and pick me up. So they picked me up, and I'm back on the street. I'm back using, I'm back ripping and running. I wasn't done, no matter what anyone wanted me to be or anyone said to me, I wasn't ready to quit. And so I ended up getting in some legal trouble, and moving forward, I caught a few felonies. I had caught a few misdemeanors. I was in trouble in multiple counties, in Hamilton County, in Clermont County, in Brown County. And eventually that led up to me not being able to do probation, not being able to do anything that they asked me to do in the court system. By 21, I was with a drug dealer. I was in a relationship with him, and I became pregnant. And this is a very painful part of the story for me because I still am in no contact with my daughter today. But I am believing that God is going to restore and heal that relationship. I have faith in His timing. So at 21, I became pregnant by my dealer, and I delivered a baby. But I was still in addiction, and so they took her from the hospital for me. And that was at a point in my life where I remember I was at the lowest that I could ever be. Because there was a point in my teenage years when I was partying and running around that I actually looked at women that had lost children and judged them and thought harshly of them. And even the thought had crossed my mind, how could you ever choose drugs over your child? And, you have to be real careful about how you look at people and how you judge them, because you truly don't know until you walk in their shoes. And so I delivered her. She was born with drugs in her system when I was 21, and they removed her. CPS came and took her. And after that, that was really the darkest part of my addiction. That's when I had lost all hope. I self-sabotaged every healthy relationship in my life because I felt like I didn't deserve to live. A person that can't stop using for a child that they created is just, the lowest of the low. That's how I felt. So I had no hope. So moving forward, again, I had a lot of legal trouble following me. So I end up in court. At this point, I have many, many charges racked up, and I end up in a court system in Brown County. So, which is out in the country, and they're a little less tolerant than, on closer to Cincinnati. So they had saw my extensive record, and they saw, how the system viewed me was, look, she's a statistic. She's either going to kill somebody or kill herself. She's a menace to society. Lock her away. Put her away. So this time, they ended up sentencing me to 36 months in the Ohio reformatory prison for women. So I got shipped up to Marysville. I eventually got moved to Dayton Correctional Institution because I was from, that area from Clermont County, and it was easier for my family to come and visit me. And my grandma and grandpa, they would come every month and visit me, and that support meant the world to me because, I didn't deserve it. I mean, I had even put them through hell. I would go years without seeing them because I knew what I was capable of. I was capable of stealing for my addiction. I was capable of hurting anyone or anything that was in the path of that drug. So I would go sometimes, months and not speak to them. But my grandpa, he was very stubborn. He would bang on trap doors. I'm not kidding you. He would bang on trap doors, and he would say, I know my granddaughter's in there. Bring her out. And I'd be at the other side of the door saying, no, tell him I'm not in here. No, I know Cynthia's in there. I'll buy you guys a Coney crate if you send her out. And they would tell me every time. But so my grandparents, I kind of lost track on that, but it's a funny story. My grandparents would come to the prison at DCI and they would see me every month. And I looked forward to it so much. And it was a good time in my life, even though it was the worst time because I was incarcerated. That was the first time in many, many years that I had a clear head. And it was the first time where I felt almost safe in those prison walls. I know it sounds confusing, but that's how people get institutionalized, because they're in there and they're controlled by others. They're told when their meals are. They can't really act on impulse. It's very structured. And so since my life had been so chaotic from the time I was very little up until I got sent to prison, it almost felt like it was like safe to me. And I know that sounds crazy, but it was. So that was a good time in my life of sobriety. It was the longest I had been sober in quite some time, and having them visit, that was a big help. So when I was in prison, I stayed sober the entire time, and I tried to get my life straight and get back on track. But what I didn't realize is that all that prison was doing was just slapping a Band-Aid on a wound that wasn't healed. So when I got out, I had very high hopes. I went to a halfway house in downtown Cincinnati on McMicken, which that was the real test, because then I had some freedom and I was allowed to walk to work. I worked at the Cincinnati Reds Stadium, and I was offered drugs many times. There were dealers down there that would prey on halfway houses because they knew that the men and women that were, in those halfway houses were mostly drug addicts. So that was a test for me. And by the grace of God, I stayed sober almost the whole time, except for probably about the last month or two is when I got very comfortable, and I did relapse a few times while in the halfway house. But once I got out, I basically moved in with my grandpa. He let me move in with him, and I had met a boy who's my now husband. But the problem was that he was also fighting addiction. And so we got in a relationship, and we ended up both back on drugs. We had tried different things, going to meetings, going to different clinics to try and stay clean. But again, we were just putting a Band-Aid on the situation. So we moved away from my grandpa. He was letting us stay there, and we ended up moving out and moving into a drug house in the area, and just, back on the streets again, back ripping and running. Well, this time I end up pregnant with my now son, my 7-year-old. And I just remember thinking, like, God, I can't do this again. Like, I can't lose another child, like I won't live through it. I remember thinking that. And I remember thinking, what is wrong with me? What is inside of me that is driving me more than my maternal instinct? And so I had some relapses when I was pregnant with him, but I wouldn't say I was full blown once I got pregnant. There was a little bit of restraint, but I still wasn't living the way that I needed to live with a child inside of my stomach. So he was born, and I also had a CPS case open with him. And I just remember all of those fears flooding back in, all of those insecurities, all of that shame and guilt and everything in my mind, that torment that was going on. And that kind of drove me all the way back down to rock bottom, which, I made my own bed. I had to lay in it. So, and what's crazy is he ended up with my daughter that I told you guys about previously in the story, that I had lost years ago and never been in contact with. So I went from no contact with that first pregnancy of that little girl, her name is Madison, to now my son is placed in that same home with his sister because they like to keep siblings together. Looking back now, I can see that was God's hand. But at the time, I was very, very bitter. I felt like, that this foster family was trying to steal both of my children. Like I said, I was looking through the eyes of addiction. I didn't realize that God's grace and hand was on it the whole time. The pictures that I have now are the only pictures that I have of her, and it's from that experience where my son was in custody for 6 months. I got pictures, she even drew me some things, and I cherish those things with everything now because of that time. And so I went through, the shame and the guilt of losing custody of a second child. I have a CPS case. Me and my now husband were fighting CPS again, and I end up again, getting right back into the depths of addiction. Well, this is insert papal. This is where my grandpa comes into the story again, and he says, "Look, you need to come back home. You need to come back home. If you want to bring that boy with you, you can, but you need to come back home. We need to get you on track." And so I agreed to come back home. So we left the house that we were staying at, the drug house, and we moved back in with my grandpa. And we were still using. But we had a little bit of restraint. We had to hide it. We weren't as comfortable living with my grandpa and grandma. He was a Christian man. So we had to be kind of sneaky, as so we thought sneaky. We're not, addicts are never really sneaky. We're obvious. But we had to be kind of sneaky. So one night we are on methamphetamines. We're on speed. We hadn't slept for many, probably 3 or 4 days. And we were both in almost a state when your body goes without food and without water and without proper nutrition for days, you start to really suffer in your mind, and you start to question your reality. And that's the state that we were in this night. And I was blacking in and out. I just remember coming to that night, and I was living on that side with my now husband, and my grandma and grandpa were living on the other side. So if you can imagine, it was like a duplex. So I just remember that night, we had been up for a few days. We hadn't slept, hadn't ate. And I remember I have this vivid memory of clicking back and looking towards my husband and thinking, I've never seen a face that full of terror. He was white as a ghost, pale. And I remember in that moment thinking, why is he looking at me that way? Well, and then I black out again. And when I come to, I am in the kitchen, and there is complete chaos. My grandpa is coming through the side door from his side. My dad is screaming. He's upstairs living on the side with my grandma and grandpa, and he is screaming. And I just remember terror on all of their faces. And when I come to, I had my arms wrapped around my grandpa, and I said, "Help me," and then blacked out again. Well, there was a demon that had taken possession of me, and it had taken my husband, 2 hours to drag me from our living room to the kitchen to get to my grandpa. And my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, he didn't have a religious background. He just knew that something was severely wrong, and it was not normal for a woman that was 110 pounds to be stronger than him. So, and apparently I did some pretty bad damage to him. So bad to the point where he slept with a baseball bat under the bed for a year because he was traumatized by it. So I remember blacking in and out, and I got to a point once my boyfriend got me to my grandfather. I remember going back and forth, 2 different dialogues, my dialogue and the demon's dialogue. And I remember my grandpa looking at me and speaking to the demons and telling them, "No, she is not yours. She does not belong to you." And they would remanifest and say, "That is a lie. She is ours. She's been ours for a long time. We are going to kill her, and there's nothing you can do about it." And so that night, a spiritual battle that I didn't even have the understanding to even begin to explain back then began. And it was a back and forth dialogue of a demon and my grandpa. Now, if you guys can imagine this, it was literally a completely different voice. This was not something where it was like, oh, you thought that up, or, you hadn't slept. No, this was a very real situation where it was me and a totally different personality living inside my body. And luckily, my grandpa, he was a preacher man. He was retired, but He had enough understanding in him to recognize what this was, that this was the demonic realm, which is very real. And so he yelled for my grandma, and he had her go and get a Bible. He had her get a Hillsong CD, which I still listen to this day, Let There Be Light, best CD ever for worship and warfare. And he said, put the music on, grab a Bible. We're going to start praying the word. We're getting rid of these things tonight. They've tormented her for many, many years. Tonight they're leaving. And so that was a spiritual battle. And, you know, that night, my boyfriend then, which is my now husband, gave his life to Jesus. Because if that won't scare you enough, I don't know what will, into giving your life to Jesus. So he got saved and born again that night, and I got delivered and set free that night, and that was 7 years ago. So that night, you know, it was a spiritual battle, but I was cleaned out one by one, and I had many, many demons inside of me other than just addiction, and they were all called out one by one, and they were casted out of me. And when I woke up in the morning, you guys, the best way that I can describe it is like literally what the Word of God says when you are born again and you are a new creation. The person that I was that day before, that night before, was not the person that I was when I woke up. And if you speak to people who knew me back then and you speak to people who know me now, the difference is, it's a miracle, because literally I went from not being able to go 2 hours of my life for almost 15 years without using, to waking up in the morning with no desire at all. You know, that doesn't just happen. And I had tried everything. I had tried NA meetings, AA meetings, and I love meetings. Please don't hear me out. Do not take this wrong. I love the meetings. I love anything that supports recovery 100%. But for my story, I had exhausted all options. And I had just, you know, so to have that on-off switch literally activated in my life it was just wild. I remember that first day after getting delivered and set free from addiction, I went through our side of the house and I had trash bags of just everything, dumping stuff. Anything that had ties to my old life, you know, CDs, movies, anything that was demonic, anything that I felt like had evil ties to the past of who I was, you know. And in the back in the day, they called me Cindy, but my name is Cynthia. And so even still, if I run into somebody from my past that I used to run around with and they say Cindy, it kind of like, it takes me off guard, because it's like, that girl is dead. You know, like, she is gone. And I am a totally changed person. I am born again. I am a new creation. So I got rid of all the stuff in that side of the house that had any ties to the old Cindy. And it was just crazy. And my now husband, he also went through all his stuff, and I mean that really was a pivotal moment in his life as well, because he also struggled with addiction. So from that point on, we started to get serious about getting custody back of our son. We were able to jump through the hoops. We were able to make the meetings. We were able to do everything they asked of us, to pass drug tests every week, to take accountability. And I think it almost freaked out the children's services workers too, because to see something so extreme, and they deal with the worst of the worst on a daily basis, to see that, and then to see this young couple that does a 360-degree turnaround overnight, I think it was startling for them as well. But it was a testimony of God's grace and goodness. And I know that God put me in that situation. Well, I put myself in it, but he was going to use me if I was going to be willing, because I went into CPS on fire for Jesus. I just was like, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Let me tell you about Jesus, guys, because listen to what he did for me. He did it for me. He can do it for you too. And I was just telling everyone about my experience. And so we ended up finishing our case really strong with Children's Services. And we did really well, and we ended up getting full custody back of our son, Noah. And the only thing that was kind of painful about that is that I told you guys earlier, he was with Madison, my daughter. So that was a little painful to know that, you know, in my younger years, I was foolish and I signed my rights away. And if I hadn't done that, I would have got her back too. So that was kind of a painful situation. I was in contact with the foster family. However, they dropped contact with me after I got, custody back of Noah. So, and I understand, I to this day, I don't hold anything against them. I respect them. I love them for caring for my child when I couldn't. But that's just the pain that comes with addiction. And so I got full custody back of my son, and we ended up doing really, really well, me and my husband both. He ended up getting a job at a construction company and being able to hold a job for the first time in a long time. And we just literally built from the ground up. I mean, we went from never thinking it was possible to have a home, to both have our license, to be legal functioning members of society, to fast forward to today, having a home, being married, having two healthy, beautiful children. And some days it almost feels like a dream. I'm like, pinch me, am I dreaming? Because 15 years ago in Bethel, I was on Airport Road getting heroin. So when I moved into my first home and I sat in the living room, it felt surreal. It felt like a dream. I was almost like, I can't believe your goodness, God. Like, I can't believe after everything that I've walked through and done and walked away from you, and that you still chased after me. You still went after that one. You left the 99 for me, and you literally turned my ashes into beauty. And still to this day, it's still so fresh to me. And that's been almost 8 years ago that I was delivered from addiction. And it still gets me emotional because it's like, a lot of us, we don't make it. A lot of people overdose. I have a lot of friends that died and are still dying, and so it's still very emotional to me because it's just God's grace and mercy and his beauty. And ever since I've been born again and touched by the Holy Spirit, it's been such a ride. I mean, I could tell you guys story after story of miracles that I have saw amongst my people in my life. Oh, and I forgot to tell you guys one of the best parts. One of the best parts of it is that I told you guys that my mom was also an addict. Well, excuse me. She, after my deliverance that night, I called her immediately and I told her, you are not going to believe this, but something has happened to me radical and I have to share it with you. Well, it scared her. It freaked her out. She called my grandpa and she said, what is going on? My daughter doesn't even sound like my daughter. What happened? And he explained to her, honey, your daughter got delivered from addiction. And so she was very inquisitive. She was just very inquisitive. And she said, well, if God can do that for her, can he do it for me? And me and my grandpa said, absolutely. So not even a week of being brought into the kingdom of heaven, God already has me driving over to my mother's house with my grandpa. And so we drive over there a week later, and she asked us to pray for her. And my grandpa brings some oil and we anoint her head, and, we join hands. We all three pray, and, she asks the Lord to heal her, and he does heal her. She also gets set free from addiction. And so it's crazy to think that, that light just, it spreads and stretches so far. And so I also got my mom back. Not only did I get my life back and get my son back and get my freedom back, I also got my mom back. And I hadn't remembered my mother, I hadn't remembered my mother really ever showing any emotion when I was little. I remember asking her when I was about 6, Mommy, why don't you get excited? And, I remember that, and it seemed normal to me, and it took for me to grow up and get older to realize it wasn't normal. So to get her back in my life, and we're best friends today. I mean, we are so close. She is one of my closest spiritual sisters. She is one of my best friends. She is an amazing grandma to my children. She's just an awesome Christian woman. And so to get her back in my life too was just the biggest blessing. And to see her get freedom from addiction as well was just amazing. And, even now to this day, you know, she's still doing awesome. And again, that was almost 8 years ago. So it's just the goodness of God. And I just want to encourage anybody that, you know, maybe watching this video, that, you know, in God's word, it says he doesn't show favoritism. So if he can do it for me, just like my mom said, if he can do it for her, why can't he do it for me? He can do it for you. I promise you, he can do it for you. You know, he's just waiting. He's literally just waiting for us to stretch our arm out. You know, that night when I was tormented by demons and I said, help me, I didn't realize what I was saying. I was saying to Jesus, help me. I've tried everything. I've done everything. I can't overcome this on my own. And so, you know, I just want to encourage everyone that he is here. He is here to help you. He does love you. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. He has a purpose for your life. And even when you feel like there's no hope, there is always hope. And even in our darkest moments, in my darkest moments of my stories of addiction, which I spared a lot of you guys from because I don't want to share those darkest moments, he is still there in that. And now looking back, I could see him. I could see him in everything and through everything. I could see Jesus walking with me the entire time. And so if you don't take anything else away from this, I want you to take hope. I want you to take encouragement, and I want you guys to know that you are so, so, so loved by your Creator. And that's it.